Off the eastern edge of Cape Cod, where the water runs shallow and restless over shifting bars of sand, something ancient stirs whenever a storm passes through the sea. There does not stay still for long. It moves the bottom the way wind moves a dune, uncovering in one season what it will bury again in the next, and for nearly 260 years it kept a secret in that slow, patient churn. Fishermen knew there was something down there. Old men in the villages along the outer shore spoke of coins that washed up after nor'easters, of a wreck that seemed to belong more to rumor than to record. For generations, the story was treated the way most such stories are treated, as a piece of local color, half memory and half invention. The kind of tale told at the edge of a dock on a quiet evening and rarely believed by anyone who had not grown up hearing it. And yet it was true. Beneath that moving sand, broken into the wreckage of its final hour, lay the Whydah galley, and with her, the last resting place of the pirate captain Samuel Bellamy. It is worth pausing on that plainly, because the fact itself is a rare one. Ships that sank under the black flag have always been more legend than evidence. Pirate wrecks were spoken of, painted, sung about, but almost never found. And when wreckage was found, it was almost never possible to prove beyond serious doubt that the vessel had truly belonged to those who raided under no nation's colors. Storms scatter a ship's remains far and wide. Names are lost long before divers ever reach a hull. 2 centuries can erase almost anything a historian might hope to hold on to. But the Whydah is different. She is, by the careful standard of maritime archaeology, the only pirate ship ever conclusively identified and excavated anywhere in the world. Her own ship's bell, recovered from the sand, still bearing her name, cast in the very year she was launched, so that when it finally rose out of the water, after 2.5 centuries, there was no longer any question of legend. The sea had kept its evidence all along. It had simply taken its time in giving it back. This, then, is not a story that opens with cutlasses raised or with cannon smoke drifting across a painted horizon. It is something quieter and, in its way, more remarkable. The story of how an ordinary slave ship, built for one grim purpose, became, for a matter of months, the flagship of the most successful pirate fleet of its age, and how it ended, suddenly and completely, on a night when the sea decided it had had enough of being outrun. It is the story of a young Englishman named Samuel Bellamy, who arrived in the New World with little but ambition, and who found, in the brief, brutal freedom of piracy, a way to imagine himself as something more than the world had allotted him. And it is the story of a hull of timber and iron, cannon and coin, resting now not in myth, but in the permanent, patient record of sand. There is a temptation, when telling a pirate's story, to reach immediately for spectacle. The chase, the boarding, the flash of a blade in lantern light. Those moments belong here too, and they will come, told as faithfully as the record allows. But if this chronicle has a center of gravity, it is not glamour. It is ambition meeting weather. It is the slow accumulation of choices. A young man's decision to abandon a modest life for a far riskier one. A captain's decision to press northward along a coast he barely knew. A knight's decision to keep sailing when every sign of sky and sea argued for shelter. Piracy, in Bellamy's brief career, was not a performance of freedom so much as a wager against the ordinary limits of a poor man's life in the early 18th century, and the wreck at the bottom of Cape Cod's outer shoals is what remains when that wager is finally called. To understand why a ship like the Whydah could exist at all, why a slave galley built for the horrors of the Middle Passage would end its life laden with pirate plunder, requires understanding the world that produced men like Bellamy in the first place. It was a world remade by war and unmade by peace, where sailors trained for naval service found themselves without ships to serve on, where merchant fleets crossed the Atlantic, groaning with silver and sugar and human cargo, and where the line between a legitimate privateer and an outlaw pirate was thinner and far more porous than most modern imaginations allow. It was a world of colonial ports thick with rumor of taverns where fortunes were traded in whispers, of a Caribbean so crisscrossed with shipping lanes that a patient, well-armed captain could take prize after prize and never once be forced into a fight he did not choose. Samuel Bellamy stepped into that world as one face among thousands, a young man of no particular fortune, drawn across the ocean by the oldest promise the sea has ever offered, that a life could be remade entirely by what a man managed to take from it. None of this unfolds quickly, and it should not. The story of the Whydah is not one long chase scene compressed into a single explosive night, however much the wreck's discovery might suggest otherwise. It is, instead, a chronicle built in layers, the world that shaped a captain, the ship that carried him, the storm that ended him, and the long silence afterward, broken only by the slow work of sand and tide, and eventually of men patient enough to go looking. Each layer deserves its own weight. Each deserves to be told without rushing toward the wreck, because the wreck itself only means something once the reader understands what was lost inside it. Not simply gold and silver, though there was plenty of both, but a moment in history when a single ship briefly held together the fortunes and fates of more than 140 souls. Free men and captives both, in the final hours before the sea took nearly all of them at once. So let this be understood at the outset, the way a chart is studied before a voyage begins. What follows is not a tale of swashbuckling triumph, nor a morality play dressed in a black flag. It is a patient accounting of ambition and accident, of a young captain's rise and the single night that ended it, and of the long, strange afterlife of a wreck that spent nearly 260 years being rumor before it was finally allowed to become history. The Whydah galley will be built, plank by plank, in the pages ahead, much as she was built in the yards of London so long ago. She will be chased down and taken, refitted and renamed, filled with the wealth of a dozen captured ships, and turned at last toward a coastline that would prove far less forgiving than any enemy she had ever faced. And when the story reaches its center, the storm, the breaking hull, the cold Atlantic closing over deck and rigging alike, it will be told with the same unhurried patience that the rest of the story deserves, because that patience is, in the end, the truest way to honor what actually happened out there in the dark, off a shore that still, to this day, keeps giving pieces of her back. Before that story unfolds, there is room here simply to sit with the wonder of it. The plain, quiet fact that somewhere beneath the restless sand off Cape Cod, an actual pirate ship rested undisturbed for nearly 260 years, indifferent to the myths built up around her, waiting only for the sea to decide, storm by storm, how much of herself she was willing to show. It is a rare thing in the study of the past to find a legend and a fact turn out to be the very same object. The Whydah is that rare thing. And if this is the kind of story that draws you in, great ships built by ambition and unmade by weather, chronicles of the sea told slowly and carefully across the long arc of history, then this channel is a quiet place to keep returning to, and a subscription costs nothing but ensures you will not miss the next one. For now, though, let the sand settle, let the tide draw back, and let the story begin where every honest chronicle of a life must begin, not with the wreck, but with the world that made the man who sailed her. To understand the Whydah, one must first understand the ocean she was born into, and the world of hunger and opportunity that produced the man who would take her by force. The early years of the 18th century were a peculiar hinge in history, a moment when the old empires of Europe had stretched themselves thin across the Atlantic, laying claim to coastlines and harbors and shipping lanes they could not possibly police. Spain still held the greatest share of the treasure that crossed those waters. Silver, dragged up from the mountains of Peru and Mexico, packed into the holds of galleons bound for Seville. England, France, and the Dutch Republic circled that wealth with envy, building colonies of their own in the Caribbean and along the North American coast, each hoping to skim some portion of the riches for itself. And in the wide gap between what these empires claimed and what they could actually enforce, a different kind of life took root. Historians would later give this period a name it never used for itself: the Golden Age of Piracy, a rough span of decades on either side of the year 1700, when the sea lanes of the Atlantic and the Caribbean swarmed with men who answered to no flag but their own. It helps to picture the geography of that world plainly. The Caribbean basin, dotted with islands controlled by half a dozen competing crowns, was laced with narrow channels and shallow cays where a small fast vessel could vanish from pursuit within the hour. The American colonies, still young and thinly governed, offered harbors where a ship's cargo might be sold with few questions asked, provided the right hands were greased. Between these places ran the great commercial arteries of the age. Sugar from the islands, slaves from the African coast, silver from the Spanish Main, manufactured goods from Europe. An entire economy stitched together across thousands of miles of open water. A warship might patrol a stretch of coast for a season and then be called home for a war in Europe, leaving the waters empty again. It was in the truest sense a frontier, not a landless wilderness but a watery one, claimed on paper by kings and enforced in practice by whoever happened to be strongest in a given stretch of sea on a given day. Into a world built this way stepped Samuel Bellamy, a young Englishman whose early life survives only in fragments, the kind of thin documentary trail common to men who were not born to matter and only came to matter later, and by then, rather suddenly. The most persistent account places his birth in the West Country of England, in Devon, in the early 1680s, to a family of no particular wealth or standing. Later tellings dress this origin in more romantic cloth, suggesting he came from still humbler stock. Perhaps orphaned young, perhaps raised in the rough education that a childhood near the docks of a port town could provide, watching ships come and go and listening to the talk of men who had seen the wider ocean. Whatever the precise shape of his boyhood, the broader truth holds steady across every version. He was not a nobleman's son, not an officer bred for command, but an ordinary young man from an ordinary corner of England, with no inheritance of consequence waiting for him and no clear path upward within the rigid social order of his own country. For a man in Bellamy's position, England in these years offered little. The path of a common sailor was long, poorly paid and dangerous, a life of climbing, rigging in the freezing Atlantic dark for wages that a captain might withhold on the thinnest of pretexts, all in service of a merchant or a crown that would never know his name. And yet the ocean that limited him at home also offered, at its far edge, the one thing that might change his fortune. Ward had been spreading through English ports for years of treasure, literally sitting on the sea floor. In the summer of 1715, a Spanish treasure fleet bound from Havana towards Spain had been caught in a hurricane off the coast of Florida, and most of its ships had gone down heavy with silver and gold. Coin meant for a Spanish crown fighting to recover from years of war. The wrecks lay scattered along the shallow coast, and by the following year, word of salvage crews working those wrecks and of fortunes being made and stolen from them had crossed the Atlantic and settled in the taverns of English ports like a fever. It was this rumor, more than any other single cause, that is said to have carried Samuel Bellamy across the ocean, a young man chasing the oldest promise there is, that somewhere across the water a different life was waiting, if only a man were bold enough or lucky enough to reach it first He was not sailing into an entirely foreign world when he came across the Atlantic. He was sailing into a version of the same world he had left, only rearranged, its rules loosened, its hierarchies less fixed. And it is here that the story requires a kind of patience with categories that the era itself refused to keep separate. In the popular imagination, a sailor, a privateer, and a pirate are three distinct kinds of men standing in a clear moral order from lawful to criminal. The reality of the early 18th century was far less tidy. A privateer was, by definition, a sailor authorized by his government to attack and plunder the ships of an enemy nation, carrying a document called a letter of marque that transformed what would otherwise be piracy into a legal act of war, so long as the target flew the wrong flag. During wartime, these men were heroes, celebrated in port, and rewarded with a share of whatever they captured. But wars ended, and when they did, letters of marque expired, governments recalled their commissions, and thousands of trained, armed sailors who had spent years learning no trade but plunder were left with a choice: return to the miserable wages and harsh discipline of merchant service, or continue the only work they knew. Now, without the legal cover that had once protected it, the line between privateer and pirate, in other words, was often not a line at all, but a signature on a piece of paper, one that a change in politics could erase overnight. Man might sail under the King's commission on a Tuesday, and with that commission lapsed, sail the very same waters as an outlaw by the following spring, doing precisely the same work with precisely the same skills. Samuel Bellamy arrived in this world at exactly the moment when that line had become thinnest of all. The War of the Spanish Succession, which had occupied European navies and privateers alike for over a decade, had ended in 1713, flooding the Atlantic with unemployed sailors of exactly the kind Bellamy would soon join. Whether he first went to Florida seeking honest salvage work on the wrecked treasure fleet, as some accounts suggest, or drifted more directly toward the company of men already living outside the law, the sources do not agree, and no single surviving record settles the question. What can be said with more confidence is the shape of the hunger that drove him, because it was the same hunger driving thousands of men like him across the Caribbean in those years. Not a taste for cruelty, not villainy for its own sake, but the plain wish for a life with more room in it than the one he had been given. A poor man's son with no land, no title, and no prospects beyond a lifetime of hard, underpaid labor at someone else's command could look at the sea and see, for the first time in his life, a place where the old rules of birth and rank did not entirely apply, where a fast ship and a bold crew might carve out in a single season what a lifetime of honest service could never provide. It is this emotional register, more than any love of violence, that historians who have studied Bellamy tend to emphasize a young man reaching for a different life, in a world that had made such reaching both possible and dangerous in equal measure. He was not unique in this. He was, in fact, entirely typical of his age. One restless sailor among thousands, drawn by the same rumors, driven by the same want, sailing into waters where the line between lawful service and outright piracy had already begun, quietly and almost invisibly, to dissolve beneath his feet. The vessel that carried him south was a small one, and the venture that shaped it was at first entirely legal. Samuel Bellamy had fallen in with a goldsmith of Rhode Island named Palsgrave Williams, a man some years his senior, comfortable enough in his circumstances to have no obvious need of adventure, and yet drawn to it all the same. Williams had money, or access to it, and connections along the coast that a penniless sailor lacked. Bellamy had youth, nerve, and whatever seafaring skill he had gathered in his years before the mast. Between them, they assembled the makings of a modest expedition and set their sights on the wrecks of the Spanish Plate Fleet, the same fleet whose loss off the Florida coast in the summer of 1715 had sent a shudder of excitement through every port from Boston to Port Royal. The story of that fleet was, by the time Bellamy and Williams set out, already half legend. A dozen heavy ships, laden with silver and gold drawn from the mines of Mexico and Peru, had left Havana bound for Spain and had been caught by a hurricane along the Florida shoals. Most of the vessels went down within sight of the coast, scattering their cargo across the shallows in a wreckage field that stretched for miles. Spain moved quickly to recover what it could, establishing a salvage camp and posting guards, but the scale of the loss was too great to be entirely secured, and word of unguarded silver lying in a few fathoms of clear water spread through the taverns and counting houses of every English colony within reach. Men who had never gone to sea for anything more dangerous than fish began outfitting sloops. Others, more seasoned, saw in the wrecks not a fortune to be plucked easily from the sand, but an opening, a chance to test the waters, quite literally, of a trade that sat just at the edge of the law. Bellamy and Williams were among the many who came south that winter with such hopes. What exactly they found, the record does not say with any confidence. Some accounts suggest they worked for a time alongside other salvagers, diving or dragging for scattered coin along the wreck sites, competing with Spanish patrols and rival crews for whatever the sea had not yet swallowed for good. Other accounts suggest the two men grew frustrated quickly, finding the richest wrecks already picked over or too closely guarded to approach. Whatever the truth of those months, the venture did not make either of them rich. The silver that had drawn them south stayed for the most part out of reach, recovered by Spanish divers, claimed by better connected salvagers, or simply lost again to shifting sand. Bellamy, according to the stories later told about him, grew disillusioned with the slow, uncertain work of honest salvage. He had come for treasure and found only labor risk and the growing suspicion that the men with legal claims and government backing would always take the largest share, while men like himself, with neither, would be left with the scraps. It was somewhere in this stretch of frustration, historians generally agree, that the turn happened not in a single dramatic moment, but as a slow narrowing of options that left piracy looking less like a crime. The exact sequence is not preserved in any surviving account with certainty, but the pattern fits a familiar one from the period. A crew of men already gathered for one purpose found themselves drifting toward another. There were ships nearby that could be taken by force rather than negotiation. There were sailors aboard those ships, some of them pressed into service against their will, who might be persuaded to join a different crew entirely, one that promised a share of the takings rather than a wage fixed by someone else's ledger. Bellamy, whatever his private reckoning, appears to have crossed that line without much hesitation once the decision presented itself. The first prizes were small, coastal traders, modest sloops, vessels whose capture demanded more bluff than battle. But each one added men to his following, and each man added weight to his reputation. It was in the running of these early prizes that the shape of Bellamy's leadership first became visible, and it is this shape, more than any single act of violence or daring, that later writers would return to again and again in trying to explain why he was remembered so differently from most men in his trade. Pirate crews of the period were not as popular imagination sometimes suggests, simple bands of outlaws obeying whoever shouted loudest. Many of them operated under written or spoken codes, articles agreed to by the whole company before a voyage began, setting out the division of plunder, the penalties for cowardice or theft from a fellow crewman, the compensation owed to a man who lost a limb in battle. These codes varied from ship to ship, but a good number of them shared a striking feature. They placed real limits on the power of the captain himself. A captain could be voted into command, and a captain could be voted out of it, particularly if his judgment failed during a chase or a fight. In matters of plunder and food, he was often entitled to no greater share than any other man before the mast. Only in the heat of battle did his word carry unquestioned authority, and even then, only because the men had agreed in calmer moments that someone needed to be obeyed when the guns began. Bellamy's own crew, as it grew through those first captures, seems to have organized itself along exactly these lines, and by most surviving accounts, he embraced the arrangement rather than resisting it. He was, by the testimony of men who later stood trial and spoke of their time aboard his ships, notably plain-spoken with his company, willing to explain his reasoning rather than simply issue commands, and quick to frame the taking of a prize, not as a captain's conquest, but as a shared undertaking of the whole crew. Whether this reflected some genuine conviction on his part about the injustice of naval hierarchy, or simply a shrewd understanding that a crew treated as partners would fight harder and desert less readily than one treated as servants, the sources do not allow us to say for certain. Perhaps it was both. What can be said is that the reputation stuck, and stuck quickly. Men who joined him by choice or by persuasion after capture spoke of him afterward, in depositions taken by colonial officials, in the half-embellished accounts that found their way into print, as a captain who listened, who argued rather than threatened, who seemed to genuinely believe that the men who risked their necks beside him deserved a voice in how the risk was managed. It was this reputation, more than any single battle or capture, that gave rise to the name history would eventually attach to him, the Prince of Pirates, a phrase that appears in later retellings and that captures, whether entirely accurate or partly invented, sense that here was a man who ruled not through terror, but through something closer to consent. Whether Bellamy ever heard the phrase applied to himself in his own lifetime is doubtful. It belongs more to the legend that grew after his death than to any document from his brief career. But legends, even embellished ones, tend to fasten onto a kernel of something real, and in Bellamy's case, that kernel appears to have been genuine. A young captain, not much more than experienced sailor himself, who ran his ship with an ear turned toward his crew rather than a boot planted on their necks. Through the early months of 1717, this growing company took prize after prize along the shipping lanes of the Caribbean and the American coast, each capture adding sailors, arms, and small stores of plunder, and each success further cementing the loose, consensual order that bound the crew together. What Bellamy did not yet have for all this growing following was a ship worthy of the reputation forming around him, something larger, faster, and better armed than the modest sloops he had commanded so far, a vessel that could carry his name into the historical record rather than leaving it, as so many pirate careers were left. 2. A scattering of court depositions and half-remembered rumor. That ship was still out there somewhere on the sea lanes between Africa and the Caribbean, still fulfilling its original and entirely legitimate purpose, its owners and crew unaware that within the year its name would belong to history for reasons no shipwright or merchant had ever intended. The ship that would come to bear this reputation had begun as so many vessels of her kind began, far from the warm waters where she would eventually meet her fate. She was built in London, in the shipyards along the Thames, where England's merchant fleet took shape plank by plank in the early years of the 1700s, at a moment when the city's trading houses were pouring capital into a business that would come to define the century's darkest commerce. The yards that laid her keel worked to the specifications of merchants who understood precisely what they wanted: a vessel fast enough to complete a difficult and profitable circuit of trade before rival ships or spoiling cargo could eat into the margins, sturdy enough to survive months at sea in 3 different oceans, and armed well enough to discourage the privateers, pirates, and enemy naval vessels that might otherwise take an interest in her. She was named the Whydah Galley, after the West African port of Whydah, on the coast of what is now Benin, a name that told anyone who knew the trade routes exactly what kind of ship she was and exactly what kind of voyage she had been built to make. The triangular trade that gave the Whydah her purpose was, by the early 1700s, a well-established and highly organized system, one that connected 3 continents in a circuit of exchange that generated enormous wealth for the merchants, financiers, and shipowners who controlled it. English-manufactured goods, cloth, guns, tools, and rum would be carried down to the West African coast and traded for captive men, women, and children who had been taken in the wars and raids that the trade itself encouraged and financed. Those captives would then be carried across the Atlantic on a crossing that came to be known as the Middle Passage to the plantations of the Caribbean and the American colonies, where they would be sold into slavery, their labor extracted to grow the sugar, tobacco, and cotton that fed the appetites of European markets. The ships would then be loaded a 3rd time with sugar, molasses, and other colonial goods, and would carry that cargo back to England to complete the circuit and begin again. It was a system built on human suffering at a scale that is difficult to comprehend even now, and the ships that served it, however elegant their lines or however skilled their construction, were instruments of that suffering, built to make the process as efficient and as profitable as the merchants who financed them could arrange. The Whydah was built to be very good at this work, in the narrow and terrible sense that her owners understood. She was constructed as a full-rigged ship, carrying 3 masts, a configuration that gave her considerably more sail area and greater flexibility in handling than the sloops and smaller vessels that made up much of the era's shipping. Her hull was built from oak, the standard material for English shipbuilding of the period, chosen for its strength and its resistance to the stresses of long ocean voyages, and her frame was cut and shaped by shipwrights who had spent lifetimes learning how to coax speed and durability out of timber and rope. She measured somewhere in the range of 100 feet in length, substantial vessel for her era, though not an enormous one, built with a hull form designed less for cavernous cargo capacity than for speed through the water, a design choice that reflected her intended use. A slave ship needed to move quickly, both to shorten the brutal weeks of the Middle Passage, during which mortality among the captives climbed with every additional day at sea, and to outrun any vessel that might attempt to seize her cargo or her profits before they reached a market. She was armed accordingly. Historical accounts describe her carrying somewhere between 18 and 28 guns, a substantial armament for a ship of her size and purpose, sufficient to deter most of the smaller predators that might have been tempted by a well-laden merchant vessel, and sufficient, though her owners could not have known this yet, to make her a very useful acquisition indeed for anyone bold enough to take her by force, rather than earn her through trade. The combination of speed and firepower that made the Whydah valuable to her original owners, a combination calculated purely in terms of commercial efficiency, protection against the ordinary hazards of 18th century shipping, was precisely the combination that would make her irresistible to a pirate captain on the lookout for a ship worthy of a growing reputation. It is worth pausing in the telling of this ship's history to sit honestly with what she was built to do before the events that made her famous ever touched her. The Whydah was constructed for the express purpose of carrying enslaved people across the Atlantic, a voyage that inflicted suffering of a kind and scale that the historical record can describe but never fully convey, a suffering inflicted by a system that treated human beings as cargo to be transported, insured. The ship herself was in this sense no different from hundreds of other vessels built in London and Liverpool and Bristol during these decades, purpose-built instruments in a trade that would come to be recognized far too late and after far too much loss as one of the great moral catastrophes of human history. Honoring the Whydah's later history, The strange turn her story would take once she changed hands does not require setting aside or softening this earlier chapter. It requires only that it be told plainly as part of the record the ship carries with her, a record that her later fame as a pirate ship has sometimes obscured but never actually erased. It was in this original capacity, as a slaver bound for the West African coast, that the Whydah made her first, and what would prove to be her only outbound voyage under her original owners. She loaded her cargo of trade goods in London, took on additional stores, and set out across the Atlantic and down toward the African coast, following the same routes that dozens of similar vessels traveled every year in service of the same trade. She would have called at Whydah or a nearby port, taken on the human cargo for which she had been named and built, and then turned west again to begin the Middle Passage, the leg of the triangular voyage during which the true horror of the trade was enacted daily in the holds below her deck. By the time she had completed this passage and delivered her cargo to buyers in the Caribbean, likely at a port associated with the sugar trade, and had then loaded sugar, indigo, and other colonial goods for the return voyage to London, she was already, whether her owners recognized it or not, a ship with a reputation among those who watched the shipping lanes for vessels worth taking. She was fast, she was well built, she was well armed, and she was, on her return leg, laden with a cargo of considerable value, precisely the combination that made a ship worth chasing down. Ooze and rumor of ships traveled quickly among the loose and scattered community of pirates, operating in Caribbean and Atlantic waters during these years, carried by captured sailors, by informants in port towns, by the simple observation of a fast, heavily laden vessel making her way along the well-known trade routes. A ship like the Whydah, sailing home with a hold full of valuable goods after having already completed the grim work that had earned her that cargo, represented exactly the kind of prize that could transform a pirate captain's fortunes and reputation in a single stroke, if only she could be caught. She was, in the eyes of anyone bold enough to consider taking her, not simply a ship worth robbing, but a ship worth keeping, an asset that could replace whatever smaller and less capable vessel a captain currently commanded. A floating instrument of speed and firepower that would allow her new master to outrun the very navies and privateers that had been built to hunt pirates down. Somewhere on the sea lanes north of the Caribbean, in the early months of the year 1717, that valuable and admired vessel was making her way home, entirely unaware that a growing reputation and a hungry ambition were converging on her position, and that within weeks her long history as an instrument of the slave trade would end, replaced by a shorter and far stranger chapter as the flagship of a pirate fleet. The Whydah galley had left the coast of West Africa some months before, her decks having borne the terrible weight of the trade for which she was built, and having delivered that suffering to the far shore of the Atlantic, she was now sailing home in the manner such ships were meant to sail home, laden not with human cargo, but with the proceeds of it. In the holds, where enslaved men, women, and children had been kept, lay now the goods for which they had been exchanged. In the markets of the Caribbean and the Americas, sugar and indigo, gold dust and silver coin, bolts of fine cloth and stores of ivory. The accumulated wealth of a single terrible voyage now converted into the kind of cargo that made a ship worth chasing. She was, by the account of those who later described her, riding lower in the water than she had on her outward crossing, her hull heavy with the value she carried, her rigging trimmed for the long Atlantic run back to England. Lawrence Prince, her captain, had every reason to feel a measure of confidence as he brought her north through the islands, for the Whydah galley was fast, well armed for a merchant vessel and manned by a crew accustomed to the dangers of the trade routes. What Prince did not know, and could not have known until the last days of that pursuit, was that the same waters he sailed carried a fleet of pirate vessels, whose captain had spent the better part of a year building toward exactly the kind of prize now beneath his own feet. Samuel Bellamy's fleet, by the early months of 1717, had grown from a single small sloop into something resembling a proper squadron, several vessels sailing in loose company, their captains and crews bound together by articles of agreement and by the shared understanding that greater ships meant greater plunder. It was somewhere in these Caribbean waters, according to the accounts that survive, that lookouts aboard Bellamy's ships first sighted the Whydah galley making her way north, and recognized in her lines and her deep draught a vessel worth far more than the modest merchant ships they had been accustomed to taking. She was not sailing alone in the sense of being undefended, for a ship of her value carried both cannon and a crew prepared to use them, but she was sailing without the escort of a naval vessel, and this alone made her vulnerable to a fleet that outnumbered her many times over. Bellamy gave the order to give chase, and what followed was not the swift, single strike that popular imagination often assigns to pirate encounters, but a pursuit that stretched across several days, the pirate vessels shadowing the Whydah galley's course, closing the distance gradually, testing her speed against their own. The chase itself, as it has come down through the surviving accounts, was a study in patience rather than the reckless daring often attached to pirate legend. Bellamy's ships were individually smaller and less heavily armed than the Whydah galley, but they possessed an advantage that mattered more in these waters than raw firepower, and that advantage was numbers. A single well-armed merchantman could hold off one attacker, perhaps two, but the arithmetic of battle changed considerably when 3 or 4 vessels converged upon her from different points of the compass, each capable of raking her decks with cannon fire, while the others closed for boarding. Lawrence Prince, watching the pirate sails multiply on his horizon day after day, would have understood this arithmetic as well as any man who had spent years at sea. And it is this understanding, more than any single dramatic encounter, that seems to have shaped the eventual outcome of the pursuit. The Whydah galley ran, using what speed her deep hull could muster, but a heavily laden ship returning from a long trade voyage could not easily outdistance vessels built and rigged for exactly this kind of hunting, and slowly, across the days of chase, the gap between hunter and hunted began to close. What makes the capture of the Whydah galley remarkable, and what has ensured its place in the story that followed, is not any violence attending its conclusion, but rather the almost businesslike manner in which the exchange was finally made. When the pirate fleet had drawn close enough that further flight served no purpose, and when Prince could see clearly the guns run out and the numbers arrayed against him, he made the decision that most captains in his position made when confronted with hopeless odds, and struck his colors without forcing the matter to bloodshed. There is no record in the surviving accounts of cannon fire exchanged in earnest, no account of boarding parties fighting their way across a contested deck, no tally of dead or wounded on either side. Instead, what the sources describe is closer to a negotiated surrender, the kind of encounter that occurred more often in the golden age of piracy than the popular imagination generally allows. Ondi, in which a captain, recognizing an impossible position, chose to preserve his crew's lives, rather than see them lost in a battle already decided by the disposition of ships and guns before a single shot was fired. Bellamy's response to this surrender revealed something of the particular character that separated him from many of his contemporaries in the pirate trade. Rather than simply looting the Whydah galley and sending her captain and crew away with nothing, or worse, he offered Prince an exchange that, by the standards of the era, could be considered almost generous. Prince and his crew were given the smaller sloop that Bellamy's fleet had been sailing, along with a portion of the plunder already taken, allowing them passage to continue their journey rather than being marooned or cast adrift without means. It was a calculated act of restraint, one that served Bellamy's reputation as well as his conscience, for word of a pirate captain who dealt fairly with those he captured, who took ships and cargo but spared the men who sailed them, was itself a kind of currency in a trade where reputation could open doors that force alone could never breach. Sailors who might otherwise fight to the last against a bloodthirsty captain often surrendered more readily to one known for mercy, and Bellamy, whether by calculation or genuine temperament, seems to have understood this dynamic well. It was in the aftermath of this exchange, once the paperwork of surrender had been settled and the sloop handed over to Prince and his men, that Samuel Bellamy stepped aboard the Whydah galley as her new master, and the moment deserves to be understood for what it represented, both to the man himself and to the pirate enterprise he commanded. Here was a vessel built to the specifications of a legitimate trading company, constructed with the finest materials the Atlantic trade could provide, armed with cannons sufficient to engage naval vessels, and fast enough to outrun nearly anything that might be sent to hunt her down. For a man who had begun his pirate career in a single small sloop, scraping together a crew and a cause from the discontented sailors of the Caribbean, the Whydah galley represented not merely an increase in wealth, but a fundamental transformation in what his enterprise could become. Proof, sailing under his own flag now, that the ambition which had driven him from the wreck-diving expeditions off Florida to the deck of a pirate vessel had found its full expression, that the boy who dreamed of Spanish silver had become the captain of a ship that could rival anything the Royal Navy might send against him. The accounts of this period suggest that Bellamy moved quickly to make the Whydah galley his own, transferring his flag and his most trusted men aboard her, retaining her impressive array of cannon while adding still more from his previous vessels, until she carried something in the range of 28 guns. A formidable armament for any ship of her size in these waters. He kept her name, a decision that itself carries a certain resonance, for the Whydah galley continued to be called by the name that tied her to the African coast and the terrible trade that had built her, even as she became something entirely different under Bellamy's command. Had been an instrument of human suffering was now in an irony that the historical record does not shy away from, transformed into the flagship of men who had themselves often escaped bondage, indenture, or the brutal discipline of naval and merchant service, men who found in piracy a rough and violent freedom. This capture, occurring as it did in the early months of 1717, marks the point at which the story of Samuel Bellamy begins its transformation from the account of an ambitious young pirate captain building a modest fleet into something closer to legend. The tale of Black Sam Bellamy and his great ship that would echo through the decades and centuries that followed. The Whydah galley, so recently an instrument of the slave trade's brutal economics, now became the vessel through which a different kind of story would be told. One of sudden wealth, of a pirate's brief reign along the American coast, and of a fate that awaited her only months away, in waters far colder and far less forgiving than those in which she had just been won. Once the Whydah galley passed into Bellamy's hands, she did not remain the ship that had crossed from London to the African coast and on toward the Caribbean in the service of trade. Within days of her capture, the work of refitting her began, and it proceeded with the particular thoroughness of men who understood that their lives might soon depend on the strength of a deck plank or the true aim of a swivel gun. The carpenters among Bellamy's crew, and there were a number who had learned their trade in honest yards before circumstance or inclination carried them into piracy, set about reshaping her for a different kind of voyage. Where her holds had once been fitted for the packing of human cargo, spaces built for suffering on a scale that beggared description, they now cleared room for shot and powder, for coin and bar silver, for the accumulating plunder of a fleet that had begun to answer to Bellamy's command. The armament of the ship grew steadily as prizes were taken and stripped of what could be used. Where the Whydah had sailed from London, carrying perhaps 18 guns, sufficient for a merchant vessel expecting only the ordinary hazards of the sea, she now carried something closer to 28, by most accounts that survive, arranged along both sides of her deck in a display of firepower. She had not been built as a warship, but she had been built well, with a hull strong enough to bear the recoil and weight of gun after gun without straining at her seams, and this had likely been part of what drew Bellamy's eye to her in the first place. A galley of her design, fast under sail and sturdy in construction, made an ideal platform for a pirate captain who understood that speed alone would not always serve him. There would be moments when he needed to fight, and the Whydah, refitted, gave him the means. Her crew swelled in these same weeks. Bellamy's company, which had numbered only a small band aboard his original sloop, grew through the addition of men taken from captured vessels, some pressed unwillingly into service, though pirate crews of this era relied far more often on volunteers than later legend allowed. Sailors of the period had few illusions about the life that awaited them aboard a merchant ship or a naval vessel, where wages were meager, discipline harsh, and the chances of injury or death from disease and accident were substantial even without the added danger of combat. Aboard a pirate ship, by contrast, a man might find better food, a share of plunder proportional to his worth, and a voice, however limited, in decisions that affected his own fate. It should come as no surprise that Bellamy's crew grew quickly to more than 100 men, drawn from the decks of the ships he took, from taverns along the American coast, and from the ranks of sailors who had simply had enough of the world as it had been arranged for them. The hold of the Whydah, meanwhile, filled with the accumulated wealth of Bellamy's short but remarkably successful career. Coin made up a significant portion of this treasure, minted silver and gold drawn from the ships of several nations, for piracy in these waters recognized no particular flag as safe from its attentions. Alongside the coin sat sugar, taken from vessels sailing out of the Caribbean plantations, and indigo, the deep blue dye so valued in the textile trade of the period, along with ivory, likely carried over from earlier voyages along the African coast before ever falling into Bellamy's possession. This was the strange inheritance of a ship built for one form of commerce now carrying the fruits of another, no less connected to suffering and exploitation in its origins, though the men who now controlled it thought little of such continuities. To them, the hold represented simple wealth, the physical evidence of success, and each new capture added to a treasure that some later estimates would place in figures difficult to credit, though the exact sum remains, like so much about the Whydah, a matter of educated reconstruction rather than certain record. Life aboard this floating arsenal took a shape that would have been unfamiliar, even shocking, to sailors serving under the flag of any established navy or merchant company. Pirate crews of this era, and Bellamy's in particular, are documented as having operated under a form of governance that modern observers have sometimes called, not without justification, an early experiment in rough democracy. Decisions of consequence, whether to pursue a particular vessel, whether to accept a truce, whether to maroon a man who had violated the crew's agreed code, were put to a vote among the company, with each man's voice carrying equal weight, regardless of his standing before he came aboard. The captain himself held his position at the pleasure of the crew, subject to being replaced if his judgment failed too often or too badly, a check on authority almost entirely absent from the naval and merchant vessels of the period, where a captain's word was law and dissent could be answered with the lash or the noose. This arrangement extended to the division of plunder as well, rather than the wildly unequal distribution common aboard legitimate ships, where officers claimed the great bulk of any prize money and ordinary sailors received scraps. Pirate articles typically specified shares calculated according to a man's role and his contribution, with the captain and quartermaster receiving somewhat more than an ordinary hand, but not by the vast margins seen elsewhere. A wounded man might receive compensation from a common fund, an early and rough form of insurance against the injuries that piracy, like any life at sea, made inevitable. These articles, agreed upon before a voyage began, and signed or marked by every man aboard, functioned as a kind of constitution for the ship, a written code that bound captain and crew alike, and that could not be altered without the consent of the company as a whole. None of this made the Whydah a gentle place. Discipline aboard pirate vessels could be severe, and the codes that governed conduct included harsh penalties for theft from a fellow crewman, for cowardice in battle, for bringing a woman aboard against the ship's rules, or for striking another man in anger without cause. The romantic image of piracy as a life of unrestrained freedom obscures the reality that any ship, pirate or otherwise, required order to function, and Bellamy's crew maintained their own version of that order, harsh in places but consistent in its application across every rank. What distinguished it from the naval world was not the absence of consequence, but the presence of consent. The fact that the men living under these rules had, in some meaningful sense, agreed to them. There is a particular strangeness in the fact that the Whydah, of all ships, became the stage for this experiment. She had been built and launched as an instrument of one of the most brutal enterprises the Atlantic world had yet produced, vessel whose original purpose was to profit from the total subjugation of human beings, stripped of any voice in their own fate, treated as cargo rather than as men and women with claims of their own. Now, the same hull carried a company that had, in its own limited and imperfect way, constructed something like the opposite arrangement among themselves, a system in which a sailor's word counted, where a man could challenge a captain's decision, where the profits of the voyage were divided with an eye toward rough fairness rather than concentrated in the hands of the few. It would be a mistake to romanticize this too far. The equality practiced aboard the Whydah did not extend to those they captured, nor did it erase the violence and coercion that remained part of the pirates' trade. But the contradiction sat there nonetheless, unremarked upon by the men themselves, who likely gave little thought to the irony of it and left instead for later generations to notice a slave ship turned, however briefly and however imperfectly, into a floating society that valued a man's voice over his birth and his skill over his station. Bellamy himself seems to have embodied this contradiction as much as the ship he commanded. Accounts describe him as a captain who spoke to his crew of liberty and equality in terms that sound almost like a political philosophy, however rough its expression, arguing that men who sailed under him did so as free agents rather than servants, that the articles they had signed made them partners in the enterprise rather than subjects of his will. Whether he believed this fully or found it a useful way of binding his crew's loyalty, or both, the ship beneath his feet carried the evidence of his success in her groaning hold, and the men around him, for the moment, had reason enough to trust the arrangement that bound them together. By the spring of 1717, the waters off the Bahamas had grown thin with opportunity, picked over by the very success that had made Bellamy's name known from Nassau to the Windward Passage. A pirate's fortune once made presented its own quiet problem, one that no amount of plundered silver could entirely solve, where a man might go to spend it, or simply to rest, without the noose finding him first. The Caribbean, generous as it had been, was growing crowded with naval patrols dispatched from London and Madrid alike. Each government tired of losing ships to men who answered to no flag but their own convenience. Bellamy, weighing the currents of both weather and fortune, made the decision that would carry his story north, away from the warm waters where he had built his reputation, toward the colder and less charted coast of British America. The choice was not made lightly, nor was it made alone. Bellamy commanded now not a single ship, but something closer to a small fleet, a procession of captured vessels trailing the Whydah like ducklings behind a mother swan, each one taken in some earlier action and pressed into service as a floating warehouse for the plunder that had outgrown the Whydah's hold. There was the Marianne, under the command of Bellamy's quartermaster and close companion, a sloop that had sailed with him since the earliest days of his partnership with Hornigold. There were prizes more recently taken, their original captains and crews either persuaded to join the account or left ashore to make their way home as best they could, their ships now serving purposes their builders had never intended. Together, this small armada moved north along the coast like a caravan of the sea, laden with sugar, indigo, ivory, and the coined wealth of a dozen nations, more treasure gathered in months than most legitimate merchants saw in a lifetime of honest trade. The decision to sail north carried practical logic that any sailor of the period would have recognized. The spring season offered a narrow window before the hurricane months made southern waters treacherous, and the northern colonies, still growing and hungry for goods that arrived without the burden of customs duties, offered markets willing to look past the origins of cheap sugar or fine cloth. Boston and the smaller ports scattered along the New England coast had long tolerated and sometimes quietly welcomed the trade in goods that pirates brought ashore, provided the arrangement remained discreet and the local merchants took their cut. For a captain sitting atop a fortune that needed converting into something more useful than raw plunder, the northern colonies represented not sanctuary exactly, but opportunity, a place where the proceeds of the account might be quietly absorbed into the ordinary commerce of the coast. Yet the historical record, thin as it often is on matters of a pirate's private thoughts, has left room for another explanation, one that later generations found impossible to resist, and that has attached itself to Bellamy's story with the tenacity of legend. According to accounts that took shape in the years and decades after his death, accounts that scholars regard with appropriate caution given how thoroughly the tale improved with each retelling, Bellamy sailed north, not merely for commerce. Her name, as the story tells it, was Maria Hallett, a young woman from the small Cape Cod town of Eastham, said to have fallen in love with Bellamy before his career as a pirate began, when he was still an ordinary sailor with nothing but ambition and ocean before him. The story holds that he had promised her he would return once he had made his fortune, that the wealth he sought was never entirely for himself, but was meant, in some part of his reckoning, to be laid at her feet as proof that he had kept his word. Whether such a promise was ever made, whether Maria Hallett existed at all in the form the legend describes her, remains a question the sources cannot answer with confidence. No contemporary document places her definitively in Bellamy's life, and the tale bears more than a passing resemblance to other maritime legends of lovers separated by the sea, stories that populate the folklore of every coastal community that ever watched its men sail away. And yet the story persists, told and retold in the taverns and later the histories of Cape Cod, because it offers something the ledgers of stolen sugar and captured silver cannot: a human thread running through the middle of an otherwise brutal trade, a suggestion that even a man who had turned pirate carried within him an older, gentler ambition. One that had nothing to do with gold at all. Whether Bellamy believed himself bound for Maria Hallett's arms or simply toward a profitable market, the ships turned north together, carrying within their holds both the plunder that made the story possible, and if the legend is to be given any credit, the private hope that made it matter. The fleet's progress north was not a straight or hurried affair. Ships under sail moved at the pace of wind and current, and a company burdened with the weight of captured cargo, already stretched thin in terms of experienced hands, to manage so many vessels at once, could not simply race toward its destination. There were prizes to be evaluated, decisions to be made about which captured ships were worth keeping and which might be released or abandoned, and the constant work of keeping so scattered a fleet together across open water, where a single storm or a moment's inattention. The Whydah herself, still relatively new to Bellamy's command, having been taken only weeks before in the chase that had ended so decisively in his favor, was still being learned by her new crew, her rigging and her particular temperament in different winds, still a matter of ongoing discovery for men who had sailed her only a short while. As the ships moved up the coast, they passed through waters that grew steadily less familiar to men who had spent most of their careers in the warm latitudes of the Caribbean. The character of the sea itself began to change, the water taking on a colder, grayer aspect, the coastline shifting from the low sandy shores and coral reefs of the south to the rockier, more forbidding edges of New England, where the land met the ocean with less patience and the weather turned without the warning a southern sailor might expect. None of the men aboard the Whydah or her consort ships had reason in late April to think much of this change beyond its practical inconvenience. Spring in these latitudes was, by most accounts and by most years, a season of manageable weather, difficult perhaps but not commonly dangerous, in the way that late summer's hurricane season could be feared even by experienced captains. The men aboard had weathered storms before, had watched skies turn dark, and had come through them, and there was little in their collective experience to suggest that the waters ahead held anything they could not manage with the same skill that had carried them this far. It is only in hindsight, with the knowledge of what waited for them along that stretch of coast, that the spring passage north takes on the quality of a journey moving steadily and unknowingly toward its own undoing. The waters off Cape Cod, though less feared than the hurricane belt further south, carried their own particular danger, a danger born not of tropical fury, but of the peculiar collision between warm Gulf currents and cold northern air, a mixture capable of producing storms as violent and as sudden as anything the Caribbean could offer. Storms that local sailors understood and respected, but that a fleet of men new to these waters, however skilled they were in the arts of sailing and combat, had no particular reason to anticipate. The ships moved forward through calm water under skies that gave for the moment no indication of what lay ahead, their hulls heavy with the fruits of a season's piracy, their captain's thoughts perhaps divided between the practical business of finding a market for his plunder and the private hope, real or legendary, of a reunion long promised and long delayed. Behind them lay the warm waters where Bellamy had made his name and his fortune. Ahead lay a coastline that would, within a matter of days, write the final and most enduring chapter of his story, though nothing in the calm spring air gave any hint of the violence that was gathering. Still unseen, somewhere beyond the horizon they sailed so steadily toward. The last days of April in the year 1717 brought a kind of weather to the New England coast that sailors of the age had learned through hard experience to read as more than simple inconvenience. The air along the shore had turned close and heavy, the sky taking on a low grey cast that pressed down upon the water like a lid settling onto a kettle. Those who lived by the sea in the small fishing towns of the Cape had ways of speaking about such skies without needing instruments to confirm what their eyes and their bones already told them. A haze at the horizon, a stillness in the gulls, a certain colour to the light in the late afternoon, these were the accumulated knowledge of generations who had no barometer beyond the ache in a joint or the restlessness of livestock before a change in the weather. And in those final days of April, according to the accounts that survive from shore witnesses and later chroniclers, the signs had been gathering for some time before the fleet of Samuel Bellamy ever came within sight of the outer arm of Cape Cod. The two ships and their prizes were moving northward along a coast that offered little forgiveness to those unfamiliar with its dangers and even to those who knew it well. Cape Cod curls into the Atlantic like a bent arm, its outer shore facing directly into the deep ocean with none of the shelter that a bay or sound might offer. Along this stretch of coastline, the seabed rises and falls in long, unpredictable ridges, shifting sandbars built and rebuilt by centuries of current and tide, submerged just beneath the surface in places where a ship's draft might find only a few feet of clearance before the hull met sand. Sailors of the period called this stretch by names that themselves carried a kind of grim honesty. The backside of the Cape, the graveyard of the Atlantic, for the wrecks that had already accumulated along its length before Bellamy's fleet ever approached it. The shoals extended in places for miles beyond what the eye could judge from a ship's deck, invisible beneath water that might appear calm and navigable, even as it concealed a bar lying just below the keel's reach. Bellamy's pilot, a man named Richard Noland, who had joined the crew and who possessed by reports some familiarity with the New England coast, would have been aware of these dangers in general terms, though the specific knowledge required to thread a large ship safely along that shore in deteriorating weather was a different matter altogether from simply knowing that danger existed. The fleet's course took them along the outer arm, past the low dunes and scrub pine of what is now Wellfleet and Eastham. Waters that even in calm conditions demanded careful attention to depth and current, and that in worsening weather offered almost no margin for the errors that fatigue, darkness, and confusion. Through the day, as the ships held their northward course, the weather continued its slow deterioration. The wind, which had been blowing from a quarter that gave little immediate alarm, began to shift and strengthen, backing around toward the northeast in a manner that any sailor of the region would have recognized as the signature of a particular kind of storm, one that New England mariners had already begun to call by the name that has endured into the present. A nor'easter, a storm born of the collision between cold air pressing down from the north and the warmer, moisture-laden air drawn up from the ocean to the south and east. Such storms, then as now, could arrive with a speed and violence that outpaced the ability of ships under sail to seek shelter, particularly along a coast where shelter itself was scarce, and where the very shoals that made the coast dangerous also made any attempt to run for the shore in worsening conditions a gamble with its own considerable risk. By the time evening settled over the fleet, the character of the weather had changed from unsettled to genuinely threatening. Rain began to fall, first in scattered bursts and then in a steadier, harder sheet that reduced visibility to a matter of yards rather than miles. The wind, which had continued its slow climb throughout the day, now began to rise with an urgency that left little room for the customary adjustments a crew might make to reduce sail and prepare for rough weather. Whatever canvas remained aloft would have strained and cracked under gusts that grew steadily stronger as the night advanced, and the ships themselves, the Whydah included, would have begun to labor in a sea that had transformed from the long, easy swells of the open Atlantic into something shorter, steeper, and increasingly violent. The waves piling upon each other in the confused pattern that a shifting wind produces when it works against the established rhythm of the ocean beneath it. The 18th century mariner possessed tools that, while sophisticated for their era, offered only a partial defense against a storm of this character. A compass could tell a captain his heading. A lead line, cast repeatedly into the dark water ahead, could give some warning of shoaling ground by measuring the depth beneath the keel. A skilled navigator might estimate his position by dead reckoning, tracking speed and course and time elapsed since the last confirmed position. But none of these instruments could see through rain and darkness to chart the exact location of a sandbar shifting beneath a churning sea, and none could substitute for the simple, brutal fact that a ship under sail, however well handled, was still a vessel dependent upon wind and canvas for movement and for steering, and that a storm violent enough could overwhelm both. The nor'easter that closed upon Bellamy's fleet that night was, by the estimation of those who have since studied the event, a storm of unusual severity even by the standards of a coast well acquainted with sudden violence. The wind is believed to have risen to something approaching gale force, driving rain nearly horizontal and reducing the visibility of coastline and companion ships alike to nothing at all. Aboard the Whydah, In the hours as the night deepened, the crew would have found themselves engaged in the increasingly desperate work that any sailing ship's company undertook in such conditions, striking sail where sail could still be reached and controlled, securing what could be secured, and working the pumps as the hull, straining against wave after wave, began to take on water, faster than the ordinary business of a well-found ship at sea should have permitted. Whatever confidence the fleet had carried northward in the calm of the preceding days had, by this point, dissolved into the singular and consuming task of survival. The two ships and their prizes, which had sailed together in loose company along the coast, began to separate in the darkness and confusion, each vessel's fate now determined by its own construction, its own handling, and the particular patch of violent water it found itself fighting through. No signal lantern, no shouted command across the gap between hulls could have done much to coordinate their efforts. Once the storm had reached its full strength, each ship was, in the truest sense, alone. For those aboard the Whydah, the storm's violence would have carried a particular and cruel irony. For the ship had been designed, built, and outfitted as one of the finest vessels of her age, swift and strongly made, a hull that had already proven itself capable of outrunning pursuit and weathering the ordinary trials of an Atlantic crossing. But no design of that era, however skilled the shipwrights who had shaped her at their yard on the River Thames, could guarantee safety against a shore whose dangers lay not in the deep water where a ship's seaworthiness might be tested honestly, but in the shallow, shifting, invisible ground that waited beneath the surface along the outer arm of Cape Cod. The storm did not need to break the Whydah to destroy her. It needed only to drive her, blind and struggling, onto the sand that had already claimed so many vessels before her. Sand that gave no warning until the moment the keels struck it, and by then there would be little that any hand aboard, however skilled, could do to save her. The end came in darkness, somewhere past midnight, in the last hour of the 26th of April in the year 1717. The Whydah had been running before the wind for hours, her canvas reduced as far as her crew dared reduce it, her hull rising and falling through swells that no longer resembled the sea her men had known in warmer waters. Bellamy had kept her close to shore, perhaps trying to find shelter in the lee of the land, perhaps simply unable to claw his way further out into open water against a wind that had turned violently on shore. Whatever the reasoning, the choice placed the Whydah exactly where Cape Cod was most patient in its cruelty, along a stretch of coast where the ocean floor rose in long, low bars beneath water, shallow enough to wreck a ship and yet deep enough to hide the danger until it was too late to answer it. The sandbar did not announce itself. There was no sound of scraping wood carried ahead of the impact, no warning cry from a lookout who could see what lay beneath black water in the middle of a storm. The keel simply found the bottom, and the ship that had carried Bellamy across two oceans, that had outrun and outfought vessels built for war, that had been taken as a prize and remade as a pirate's flagship, stopped as though she had struck a wall. The masts, still carrying what canvas remained, whipped forward with a sudden halt, and the hull, no longer moving with the sea but caught against it, began to take the full weight of every wave that followed. The surf did what storms along that coast had always done to ships caught this way. It lifted the Whydah and dropped her again and again, each impact driving her harder into the sand and working loose the joints and fastenings that her Thames-built hull had held together for less than a year. Those aboard would have felt the ship dying beneath them before they understood it fully. The motion changed from the long, rolling rhythm of a vessel underway to something more violent and irregular, a shuddering that traveled through the timbers and up through the deck into the bodies of every man, standing or clinging to whatever hold he could find. Within a short span of time, by the account that survives through the testimony of those few who lived to give it, the hull began to break apart. The stern, weakened by the pounding, is believed to have separated from the rest of the ship, spilling men, cannon, and cargo into water that offered no mercy. What had been sailed as a single vessel became, in the space of minutes, wreckage scattered across a stretch of shallow sea, timbers and men alike thrown into surf, too violent for swimming and too cold for survival beyond a short while. The numbers, as they have come down through the records of the time, are difficult to hold steady in the mind. Somewhere above 100 men had been aboard the Whydah that night, the crew that Bellamy had gathered and commanded across months of successful raiding, men drawn from a dozen different origins and circumstances, bound together by articles they had signed and by the fortune they had taken together. Of that company, only a small handful survived to reach the shore. The precise count varies slightly depending on which record is consulted, but the surviving accounts agree that it was no more than a handful. Some 2 men, certainly, perhaps as many as a few more, cast up alive on a beach that had, within the same hour, received the bodies of the rest. It was a loss on a scale that few disasters along that coast, before or after, would match. An entire company, gathered under a single command and united in a single enterprise, had been ended in the length of time it takes a storm to pass over a stretch of open water. Among those who did not survive was Samuel Bellamy himself. No account describes his final moments with any certainty, no witness left behind a record of where he stood or what he did as the ship broke apart around him. What can be said, because the historical record allows it to be said, is that he did not reach the shore alive, that his body was never afterward identified among the recovered dead, and that the man who had styled himself, or been styled, by his crew and by rumor, as the Prince of Pirates ended his brief command of the seas, somewhere in the surf, off a beach that would not even carry his name into later memory in the way it carried the memory of his ship, and there is a particular quality to this kind of ending that deserves to be held quietly rather than dramatized. Bellamy had, by every account, built something remarkable in an extraordinarily short span of time, a command respected by his own men, a reputation that unsettled colonial governors, a small fleet that moved with purpose across dangerous waters. All of it ended not in battle, not at the hands of the navies that had been sent to hunt him, but in a storm that made no distinction between a pirate captain and any other sailor caught on a lee shore. The sea that had made his fortune took him back without ceremony. The treasure that had filled the Whydah's hold went into the water and onto the sand with the same indifference that took her crew. Coin, gold dust, silver bars, the ivory, and other cargo taken from ships across the preceding months. All of it was flung loose from the breaking hull and scattered across the shallows and the beach in the hours that the storm continued to work upon the wreck. Some of it would have been visible in the immediate aftermath, coins glinting among the wrack and broken timber that washed ashore in the days that followed. Far more of it would have been drawn back out by the same currents that had driven the ship onto the bar in the first place, carried into deeper water, buried by shifting sand, scattered across a stretch of sea floor that would keep it hidden for centuries. In this scattering lies much of what the Whydah would become in the long memory of the region, not merely a shipwreck, though shipwrecks along that coast were common enough, but a wreck that carried an enormous fortune into the sea at the same moment it carried away the men who had gathered it. The two losses, the human and the material, became intertwined in the stories that followed, each lending weight and strangeness to the other. 100 men lost in a single night was tragedy enough on its own terms. 100 men lost alongside a treasure of that scale became something closer to legend before the survivors had even finished giving their accounts to the authorities who questioned them. It is worth resisting even now the temptation to render this night a spectacle. The wreck of the Whydah was not a battle, not a chase, not an act of violence. inflicted by one party upon another. It was a storm meeting, a ship indifferent to the cargo in her hold or the reputation of her captain, and the result was the sudden, largely silent extinguishing of more than 100 lives in circumstances that offered little room for heroism or resistance. The men who died did so in cold water, in darkness, likely within a short distance of a shore they could not reach. There is no evidence that any of them died fighting, no last stand to describe, no final defiant act to record. There is only the fact of the storm, the fact of the sandbar, and the fact that by morning a stretch of Cape Cod beach was littered with wreckage, with bodies and with scattered coin, while somewhere beneath the waves lay the broken remains of a ship that had for less than a year been among the most feared vessels in the Western Atlantic. What legend would later make of this night, the stories of buried treasure and haunted sand that would grow across the centuries that followed, all of it would begin here in this quiet, terrible ending, with the sea reclaiming what it had briefly allowed a company of pirates to hold. The morning after came in grey and slow, the wind still gusting, though the worst of the storm had passed, and the people of Eastham, who walked down to the shore that day, found the beach transformed into something they would speak of for the rest of their lives. Sakes. The sand for miles was heaped with timber and rope and torn canvas, with barrels stove open and their contents scattered, with the small personal effects of men who had, only hours before, been very much alive. And among the wreckage were the bodies themselves, dozens of them, rolled in by the surf and left along the tide line in the postures the sea had given them, some still dressed in the fine plundered coats and buckled shoes that had marked them, in life, as men who took what they pleased from the ships of others. The contrast was not lost on those who found them. Men who had dressed as princes lay now as any drowned sailor might, indistinguishable in death from the poorest wretch who had never worn silk in his life. The colonists of the Outer Cape were no strangers to wrecks. The waters off Eastham and Wellfleet had claimed vessels before, and the local practice of walking the beach after a storm, of gathering what the sea gave up, was old and unremarkable in itself. But this wreck was different, and word of it spread quickly along the thin string of settlements that faced the Atlantic. This was not a merchantman or a fishing sloop. This was a pirate ship, one whose name and reputation had likely already reached these shores in the form of rumor and warning, and the scale of what washed in confirmed it. Coin lay scattered in the sand in quantities that must have seemed, to men and women, scraping a living from a hard coastal soil, almost impossible to credit. Silver pieces of 8, worn smooth by circulation through half the ports of the Caribbean, turned up in the rackline alongside splinters of the hull that had carried them. It did not take long for word to travel inland, and it did not take long for people to begin gathering what they could before any official authority arrived to claim it. Among the more than 100 men who had been aboard the Whydah when she struck the bar, only 2 are recorded as having survived the wreck and reached the shore alive. One was Thomas Davis, a Welsh carpenter, who had been taken from a captured vessel some months before and forced, as skilled tradesmen often were, into service aboard the pirate ship, rather than being given the choice that ordinary sailors were sometimes offered. The other was John Julian, a young man of Mosquito or mixed African and Indian descent, who had served aboard the Whydah as a pilot, prized for his knowledge of the waters they sailed. Both men were found half drowned and battered along the beach, having been thrown clear of the wreck and carried in by the same surf that had killed nearly everyone else who had been aboard that night. Their survival, whatever mixture of chance and strength brought it about, placed them immediately into a very different kind of danger than the storm itself. For to survive the wreck as a known pirate was to survive only long enough to face the law. The 2 men were taken into custody almost at once, And from there, the machinery of colonial justice began to turn with the particular seriousness that piracy inspired in the authorities of early 18th century New England. Piracy was regarded, in law and in the pulpit alike, as a crime not merely against property, but against the whole order of lawful commerce and lawful government, a rejection of the compact that bound sailors and merchants and colonies together under crown and charter. To be a pirate was to place oneself outside that compact entirely, and the punishment reserved for such men was correspondingly severe. Thomas Davis and John Julian were transported to Boston, where they were held to answer for their time aboard the Whydah, and where the case against them, and against the handful of other men connected to the wreck and to Samuel Bellamy's crew, who had survived by other means, was heard with the full formal weight of an admiralty proceeding. Davis's case turned in the end on the argument that had been available to forced men throughout the era of piracy trials, the claim that he had been taken against his will and had served under compulsion rather than by free choice, contributing his carpenter skills because refusal meant death or worse. Not because he shared in the pirates' purposes or their plunder. Witnesses were found who could speak to the manner of his taking, and the court was in this instance willing to credit the defense. Davis was acquitted, one of the fortunate few whose survival of the wreck was matched by a survival of the courtroom that followed it. John Julian's fate is recorded far less clearly, and what evidence survives suggests a harsher outcome, one shaped as much by his race and status as by any specific act he was proven to have committed. Some accounts suggest he was sold into slavery rather than tried and released, a reminder that colonial justice in this period was rarely blind to the color or origin of the man standing before it, and that the presumption of innocence extended unevenly to different bodies. The broader trial of the men associated with Bellamy's fleet, including those taken from the sloop that had accompanied the Whydah and had not wrecked that night, proceeded in Boston with a public interest such cases always drew. Piracy trials were, in this era, something close to civic theatre, occasions on which the colony reaffirmed its own order by publicly condemning those who had stepped outside it, and the presence of genuine plunder of real Spanish silver and captured goods only sharpened the public's fascination. Some of the accused were convicted and hanged, their deaths serving the same performative purpose that piracy itself had once served in reverse, a public demonstration that the reach of the law extended even to men who had spent their lives trying to escape it. Others, through luck or argument or the thin defense of compulsion, escaped the noose. The court's mercy was neither uniform nor easily predictable, and the line between a pardoned man and a hanged one often rested on details of testimony that have not survived clearly enough for later historians to reconstruct with confidence. Even as the courts in Boston worked through the fates of the survivors, word of the wreck and its scattered treasure drew the attention of those less interested in justice than in salvage. The government of Massachusetts, and the Crown's own interests, through its colonial officers, moved quickly to assert a claim over whatever could be recovered from the site, dispatching men to search the wreck and to prevent local residents from simply keeping whatever the sea had given them. But the same conditions that had destroyed the Whydah made recovering her cargo an almost impossible task. The ship had broken apart in the shallows, her timbers and contents scattered by the surf across a wide and shifting stretch of sandbar, and the technology of the time offered no real means of working beneath cold Atlantic water in any organized way. Early salvage attempts, mounted in the weeks and months after the wreck, recovered little beyond what had already washed ashore, and the bulk of the ship's silver, its plundered goods, whatever remained of the fortune Bellamy had gathered across a year of raiding, settled instead into the sand, drawn down and buried by the same currents that had ended the voyage. In time, the search was abandoned, the courts finished their work, and the men who had survived the wreck, or who had been captured elsewhere and brought to trial, faced whatever verdicts colonial justice handed down. The Whydah herself passed out of active memory as a matter of ongoing concern, no longer a threat to be chased or a treasure to be recovered by any means available, and began instead the slow transformation that shipwrecks so often undergo, from an event that happened to a story that was told. Along the outer cape, among the families who had walked that beach the morning after and seen what the sea had given up, the wreck became a piece of local lore, retold and reshaped with each passing generation, gathering the embellishments and half-truths that legend always adds to fact. Somewhere beneath the sand and the shifting bar, the ship and her fortune remained unrecovered and increasingly unreal, waiting through 2 centuries of storms and tides for the world above to remember, in a different way, that she was there at all. The years did what years do to a wreck that no one could reach and no one could raise. They turned it slowly from an event witnessed by hundreds into a story owned by no one and everyone. Passed from a mother to a daughter, from a fisherman to the boy who rode beside him, each teller adding some detail that felt true even when it could not be proven, each retelling, sanding down the sharp edges of what had actually happened, until only the shape of the thing remained. The families of Wellfleet and Eastham, who had walked the beach that April morning and seen the bodies and the barrels, did not forget what they had seen. But their children heard it differently, and their children's children heard it differently still, until the wreck of the Whydah existed less as a specific catastrophe on a specific stretch of shore and more as a fact of the landscape itself, a thing that was simply understood to be true about that part of the Cape, the way the tides were understood to be true, or the fog, or the way the dunes moved a little every winter and never quite returned to where they had been. The gold went first into rumour and then into permanent rumour, which is a different thing. In the earliest years after the wreck, there had been real searching, real men with real intentions of recovering what the sea had taken. Men like the unfortunate salvagers who had tried and failed and drowned themselves in the attempt, and their failure became its own kind of evidence, proof to the people of the Cape that the wreck did not want to be found. That something about the currents or the sand or the depth of the water conspired to keep the treasure from any hand that reached for it. This was not, of course, a supernatural claim when it was first made. It was simply an observation about a difficult stretch of surf and an unforgiving bar. But observations left alone for long enough begin to harden into something closer to belief, and belief passed down through households that told stories by lamplight and later by the glow of a stove, does not stay modest, it grows. It picks up companions, it attaches itself to other stories nearby, and on the outer cape there was no story more ready to receive it than the story of Maria Hallett. She had been, if the earliest and thinnest records can be trusted at all, young woman of Eastham, whose life had crossed briefly and painfully with the world of the man called Samuel Bellamy before he ever took to a ship or a captain's coat. The particulars are almost impossible now to separate from what was added later, but the outline that survives in local memory holds that she bore a child out of wedlock, that she was shamed and punished by the rigid expectations of her community, and that Bellamy, if he ever intended to return for her with a fortune large enough to silence any objection to their union, never did return, because the sea and the storm and the sinking of the Whydah took that possibility from both of them at once. Whether any of this happened precisely as it came to be told is a question the surviving records cannot answer with confidence, because the records are sparse. Fragments of court documents and town histories written well after the fact, more suggestion than certainty. But the story did not need certainty to survive. It needed only sorrow, and it had sorrow in abundance. A young woman waiting on a shore for a ship that would never come, a fortune wrecked at the very moment it might have redeemed her. It was perhaps inevitable that a tale like this, planted in a landscape as thick with fog and dune grass and lonely stretches of beach as the outer Cape, would grow ghostly with time. The people of the region already told each other stories of lights seen out over the water on certain nights, of figures glimpsed along the bluffs where no one should have been walking, of sounds carried on the wind that resembled voices, though no one could say whose. Into this existing weather of folklore, the story of Maria Hallett fit as though it had been shaped for the purpose. She became, in the tellings that spread through the following generations, a woman transformed by grief into something that lingered, a shape said to walk the dunes near Eastham and Wellfleet on stormy nights, watching still for a sail that would never round the point. Some versions gave her a name closer to legend than to any parish record, the Witch of Wellfleet or the Sea Witch, titles that carried the flavour of punishment as much as pity, reflecting perhaps as much about the community that told the story as about the woman it claimed to describe. Whether she had ever been accused of witchcraft in any formal sense during her lifetime is not something the surviving documentation can settle, but the accusation, real or embellished, attached itself easily to a young woman already cast out for bearing a child alone. The historical woman and the folkloric witch had become difficult to pull apart. The wreck and the woman, the gold and the ghost, folded into one another until asking which parts were true became almost the wrong question to ask of a story that had by then taken on a different kind of life. All the while, the physical wreck did what wrecks along that coast tend to do, which is disappear a little further with each passing decade. The outer Cape is not a stable place. Its shoreline is one of the most restless in the region, built of sand that the Atlantic is constantly rearranging, taking from one stretch of beach and depositing on another, cutting new bars and filling old channels, so that a coastline familiar to one generation. The very beach where the wreck first came ashore, where townspeople gathered to find timbers and bodies and coin scattered across the sand, shifted over the years that followed, the bar that had doomed the Whydah moving and reforming under the endless work of the surf, burying what had been briefly visible and exposing some fragment that had lain hidden for years before the sand rolled back over it once more. The wreck was never in one fixed place in the imagination of the Cape, because it was never entirely in one fixed place in reality either. And this uncertainty, this sense that the ship was somewhere out there beneath the moving sand, but nowhere anyone could point to with confidence, only deepened the mystery that had already begun to gather around her. And yet the rumour of treasure did not fade the way the wreck itself faded from view. If anything, it thickened with time, the way rumours of buried gold along any coast tend to thicken, feeding on the human appetite for a fortune that might, against all odds, still be within reach. Along the towns of the outer Cape, there persisted for generations a quiet, half-serious conviction that somewhere beneath the surf off Wellfleet lay coin enough to change a family's fortune forever, if only the sea could be made to give it up. Men spoke of it the way men speak of any local legend that carries the faint possibility of truth, with a laugh that did not quite dismiss the idea, a shrug that left room for wonder. Boys grew up hearing that pirate gold lay somewhere off that beach, and some of them, grown to men, could not entirely let the thought go, wading out on calm days to search the shallows for a coin the tide might have loosened, though nothing much was ever found beyond the ordinary detritus of a working shoreline. The story persisted, not because anyone had real evidence that the treasure remained recoverable, but because the story itself was too good, too rich in shipwreck and love and vanished fortune to let go of. And a coast that lived so close to the sea's uncertainty needed its legends the way it needed its lighthouses, as a way of making sense of a shoreline that took as much as it gave. For nearly 260 years, this was the whole of what remained above the surface. A name half remembered, a woman turned to ghost story, a coastline that shifted and hid what lay beneath it, and a persistent, unproven hope that somewhere out past the breakers, Samuel Bellamy's fortune was still waiting. No one had the means, in all that time, to look for it properly, to separate the fact from the legend that had grown up so thickly around it. The Whydah remained, in the truest sense, a story rather than a place, until a man arrived on that coast with charts and instruments, and a stubbornness that would, in time, turn the legend back into history. That man was Barry Clifford, and by the time he came to Wellfleet, with any serious intention of finding the Whydah, he had already carried the idea of her for most of his life. And he had grown up on Cape Cod, in a place where the story of the pirate ship buried somewhere off the outer beach was not treated as history so much as folklore, the kind of tale told to children on porches in the evening, embellished a little more with each telling, until the ship became less a vessel that had actually existed. A Cape Cod Atlantis lying just beyond where anyone could reach it. Clifford had heard these stories as a boy from an elderly relative who spoke of the wreck with the easy familiarity of someone repeating something everyone simply knew to be true, without ever being asked to prove it. He did not forget the story as he grew older, the way most people who hear such tales eventually do, filing them away as charming but essentially unusable. Instead, the idea settled into him and stayed there, patient and unresolved, the way certain questions from childhood have a way of doing, waiting for the moment when a person finally has the resources, or the recklessness, or simply the years, to go and answer them properly. He was, by trade and temperament, a diver and a salvager, someone who had spent years working along the New England coast and in warmer waters further south, learning the discipline of underwater search before he ever turned his attention to the Whydah in earnest. That discipline mattered because whatever romance clung to the idea of a pirate ship loaded with plundered gold, the actual work of finding such a vessel had almost nothing to do with romance and everything to do with patience, method, and an almost obsessive willingness to sit with paper before ever getting near the water. Clifford understood, as any serious searcher must, that the sea does not surrender its wrecks to enthusiasm alone. It surrenders them, when it surrenders them at all, to people who have done the unglamorous work first. That unglamorous work began not on a boat, but in archives, in the kind of quiet rooms where old paper is kept, and it consumed years before a single dive was ever made with the Whydah specifically in mind. Clifford and the researchers he gathered around him went looking for every fragment of documentation that might narrow the search, understanding that the Atlantic off Wellfleet was far too vast and far too capable of concealment for anyone to simply go out and start looking at random. They needed the historical record to do what it could before the ocean was asked to do the rest. This meant returning to the colonial shipping records of Massachusetts, the sort of ledgers and manifests that noted vessels lost along the coast, sometimes in a single terse line, a name, a date, a rough accounting of what had gone down and where. It meant searching out the court records connected to the trials of the surviving pirates, since the depositions taken from men like John Julian and the handful of others who had lived through the wreck contained, buried within the formal language of a criminal proceeding, actual descriptions of where the ship had gone down, how far from shore, but in what condition the sea had been, what the survivors remembered of the final hours before the hull broke apart. These were not documents written with any thought of future treasure hunters in mind, which was precisely what made them valuable. They were plain, procedural, occasionally contradictory, and entirely unromantic. And buried inside that plainness was the kind of specific, grounded detail that legend alone could never have supplied. Alongside the court records came the old maps, the sort of early charts of the Cape Cod coastline that showed how differently the shore had once been drawn, how the outer beach at Wellfleet had shifted over the centuries under the endless pressure of storm and tide. This was not a minor complication. The coastline that the Whydah had wrecked against in 1717 was not, in any precise sense, the same coastline that existed when Clifford began his search some 260 years later. Sandbars had built up and washed away, inlets had opened and closed. The entire underwater landscape just offshore, the very geography that had doomed the ship in the first place, had been continuously reshaped by the same relentless surf that had killed her, so that any attempt to search based on modern coordinates alone, without accounting for this slow and constant redrawing of the shore, was almost certain to fail. Clifford's team had to essentially reconstruct an older version of the coastline, layering historical charts against the modern one, trying to calculate where the beach itself had stood on the night of the wreck, before they could even begin to guess at where beneath the current water the ship might actually lie. All of this research took years, and it produced, at the end, not a single fixed point on a map, but a probable area, a stretch of ocean floor off Wellfleet that seemed, according to the layered evidence, that was where the second, harder phase of the search began, out on the water itself, through much of the 1980s, in conditions that made the whole endeavor feel, at times, close to hopeless. The waters off the outer cape were shallow but violent, prone to sudden weather, and above all thick with shifting sand. A seafloor that behaved almost like something alive, constantly burying and unburying whatever lay upon it, so that a search pattern run one month might mean almost nothing the next, once a storm had rearranged the bottom yet again. Visibility underwater was often poor, reduced further by the same churned sand that made the search so unpredictable in the first place, so that divers frequently worked nearly blind, guided as much by magnetometer readings and instinct as by sight. It was slow, grinding work, the kind that produced far more disappointment than progress, season after season of survey lines and anomalies that led nowhere, artifacts that turned out to belong to some other more ordinary wreck, false hopes raised and quietly set down again. And yet the search continued, funded and sustained through those difficult years by Clifford's own persistence and by the small circle of investors and researchers who had come to share his conviction that the ship was there, somewhere beneath all that shifting sand, waiting to be separated from 2.5 centuries of rumor. It is worth pausing on how much simple endurance this required, how many seasons of coming up with nothing at all, before there was any external proof that the effort was not in fact a fool's errand. Clifford had built his search on documents and reasoning rather than treasure-hunting instinct alone, but documents and reasoning could only narrow the search, not guarantee the discovery. At a certain point, the sea itself had to yield something. It did in the year 1984, when divers working the search site brought up a ship's bell from beneath the sand. A bell is among the artifacts a wreck might yield, a peculiarly perfect kind of proof, because it is precisely the sort of object a ship's crew would have taken care to mark with her name, and because it does not corrode into ambiguity the way so much else on a wreck does. When the encrustation was carefully cleaned away from the bronze, the letters that emerged were unmistakable. The bell read, "Whydah Galley, 1716, and with those words, the entire question that had hung over the site for years, question of whether this scattering of ballast and timber and cannon truly was Samuel Bellamy's ship or merely another anonymous wreck among the many that littered that treacherous stretch of coast, was answered beyond any reasonable doubt. It is difficult to overstate what that moment meant, not simply for Clifford and his team who had staked years of work and considerable money on the belief that the ship was there, but for the story itself, for the whole long tradition of half-remembered rumor that had accumulated around the Whydah since the night she broke apart. For 2.5 centuries, she had existed as a name passed down in fragments, a treasure ship spoken of with the same uncertain tone used for any legend, half believed, half doubted, impossible to verify. The bell changed that instantly and permanently. It took the Whydah out of the realm of folklore and returned her for the first time since the storm that sank her to the realm of verified fact. She was no longer only a story that Cape Cod families told each other in the dark. She was, once again, a specific ship in a specific place with a specific name cast into bronze, and now lying at last in human hands. The recovery of the bell did not end the work. It began it. What followed was not a single triumphant season, but a slow, patient unfolding that would stretch across decades, one that continues even now, long after the first divers first touched the ballast pile and understood with quiet certainty what lay beneath it. The sand that had hidden the Whydah for 260 years did not release her all at once. It held her still, in places, and gave her up only gradually, the way a tide gives up what it has taken, a little at a time, according to currents no one on the surface can fully predict. The site itself resisted haste. The waters off Wellfleet are shallow, but they are not calm. Storms move through with some regularity, stirring the sand and rearranging the seafloor in ways that could conceal a timber one season and expose it the next. The divers learn to work with this rhythm rather than against it, returning year after year, mapping the debris field in sections, recording the position of every object before it was lifted, treating the wreck less as a treasure hunt and more increasingly as an excavation in the fullest sense of the word. This shift mattered. A ship broken apart on a sandbar does not preserve itself the way a hull resting whole and undisturbed might. The Whydah's remains were scattered, mixed with ballast stones, tangled with rigging. Some fragments carried yards from where the ship had actually gone down. Understanding her meant understanding not just what was there, but where each piece had come to rest and why. Over the seasons that followed, the site gave up its contents with a kind of unhurried generosity. Cannons came first among the larger objects, their iron bodies encrusted with centuries of marine growth, requiring careful conservation once they reached the surface to keep them from crumbling as the seawater dried within their pores. Cannonballs came in quantity, stacked and scattered where they had rolled free of their racks. Rigging fixtures, blocks and fittings emerged in numbers that helped confirm the ship's scale and the arrangement of her sails, filling in details no written record of the Whydah had ever bothered to preserve, since no one aboard her had thought to leave behind a description for the benefit of a future age. Then came the coins, and it was the coins, more than anything else, that drew public attention back to the wreck again and again. Silver pieces of 8, worn smooth by circulation before they had ever gone down with the ship, spilled from the sand in handfuls, sometimes fused together into solid masses by centuries of chemical reaction with the surrounding metal and water. Gold dust appeared as well, along with small gold nuggets, remnants of the ship's African cargo that Bellamy's men had taken along with everything else when they seized her in the Bahama Channel. These fused clusters of coin and metal became some of the most recognizable objects associated with the wreck. Oddly beautiful in their ruin, more evocative in their damaged state than any polished coin might have been. They were not clean treasure, they were treasure that had been through a wreck and looked it. Weapons surfaced in quantity too. Pistols, their wooden grips, long since eaten away, leaving only twisted metal frames. Cutlass, blades, corroded but still recognizably lethal in shape. Grenade shells, cast iron spheres, meant to be packed with powder and thrown in close combat, a detail that spoke plainly of what the Whydah's crew expected to face in the ordinary course of their work. These were not decorative pieces. They were tools, carried and used, and their recovery gave researchers a clearer sense of how a pirate crew armed itself in practice. rather than in the exaggerated language of pamphlets and later fiction. But it was the smaller, more personal items that did the most to change how historians understood the men who had sailed aboard her. A cufflink bearing the initials of one crew member. A pocket watch, its hands frozen at the moment saltwater silenced its mechanism. Combs, buttons, shoe buckles, fragments of clothing that had somehow survived where flesh and bone had not. A leg bone, still wearing a silk stocking and a shoe, was recovered early in the excavation. A discovery that startled even the divers who found it. A reminder delivered without warning that this site was not only a wreck, but a grave, and that the line between archaeology and memorial ran directly through it. These personal objects mattered because they contradicted quietly and effectively much of what popular imagination had assumed about pirate life. The stereotype passed down through centuries of stage plays and later films painted pirates as ragged, lawless figures, existing entirely outside the ordinary comforts of civilization. The Whydah's wreckage told a different story. The crew had carried fine things. Some of the buttons were well made, some of the jewelry was of real quality, not crude imitation. The ship herself, before her capture, had been a well-appointed vessel, and Bellamy's men had not stripped her of her comforts so much as inherited them, living amid a strange mixture of violence and relative luxury that sat uneasily with the popular image of piracy as pure squalor. The coins told their own quiet correction as well. Pieces of 8 from Spanish mints, in wide circulation throughout the Caribbean and along the American coast, made clear how thoroughly the pirate economy was entangled with the very colonial trade it preyed upon. The money aboard the Whydah was not exotic. It was, in the main, the same currency that any merchant or colonial official of the period would have recognized and used without hesitation. Piracy, the wreck suggested again and again, was not a separate world unto itself. It was a parasitic reflection of the world. It robbed using the same coins, the same weapons, much of the same equipment, turned only slightly toward different ends. Fragments of the hull itself, recovered piece by piece from the seabed, allowed researchers to reconstruct something of how the Whydah had been built and how she had been altered after her capture. Timber sections showed evidence of the additional gun ports Bellamy's men had cut into her sides, physical confirmation of what historical accounts had only claimed in passing, that the ship had been converted from merchant service into something closer to a true man of war. Iron fittings, some still bearing traces of the rigging they had once secured, helped confirm details of her original construction as a purpose-built galley of the sort her name had always implied. A hybrid vessel meant to serve both sail and oar when the wind failed her. What emerged from all of this, gathered patiently across decades of diving, cataloging, and conservation, was something rarer than any single object recovered from the sand. The Whydah remains to this date the only fully authenticated pirate shipwreck ever found and identified with certainty. Her ownership and use for piracy confirmed not by legend or by hopeful speculation, but by the direct. Other wrecks have been proposed as pirate vessels over the years, some with reasonable supporting evidence, none with the same unambiguous confirmation. This distinction gives the Whydah an importance to maritime archaeology that extends well beyond her value as a source of treasure, considerable as that value has proven to be in its own right. She offers in a way no written account ever could, a direct material record of a specific moment in the so-called golden age of piracy, preserved not through the biased pen of a colonial official or the embellishments of a later playwright, but through the mute, patient testimony of iron, silver, bone, and timber, left undisturbed until the sea itself chose, after 2.5 centuries, to begin giving them back. Every object raised from that sandbar carries with it a small piece of a story that no one aboard the Whydah thought to record for anyone beyond themselves. and every season of careful, unglamorous work beneath those cold Atlantic waters continues, patiently, to add another fragment to a portrait that grows more complete and more human, with each recovered piece. What the wreck still teaches is not a lesson with a tidy ending, because the site off Marconi Beach has never surrendered itself completely, and those who have spent decades working that sandbar are the first to say so. Estimates of what remains below the sediment vary, and they vary considerably depending on who is doing the estimating and on what assumptions they bring to the shifting, treacherous floor of that stretch of ocean. Some who have studied the wreck for years believe that the great majority of the ship's structure and cargo has already been located and recovered, catalogued piece by piece across 4 decades of diving. Others, examining the same magnetometer readings and the same patterns of debris scattered across a wide and uneven field, argue that significant portions of the hull, and perhaps a meaningful share of the coined silver and gold that Bellamy's crew took from the ships they captured, remain buried under sand that has shifted many times since the storm of 1717, sand that the Atlantic continues to rearrange with every winter's storms and every season's tides. The disagreement is not simply a matter of pride or rivalry among researchers, though there has been some of that too over the years, as there often is when a single discovery becomes the life's work of more than one determined person. It is also a genuine scientific difficulty, because the sandbar itself is not a fixed place. It moves. The currents that first buried the Whydah continue to work upon that stretch of seafloor, covering some sections and exposing others, so that a survey conducted one year may look meaningfully different from a survey conducted the next. And an area cleared to bedrock in one decade may find itself blanketed again within a few more years by sand carried down the coast. This is, in its way, a fitting circumstance for a ship that was buried by exactly this kind of restless water, and it means that the question of how much of the Whydah remains unrecovered is not a question that will be answered once and then set aside. It is a question the ocean itself keeps reopening, gently, season after season, and archaeologists who have devoted their careers to this site have learned to hold their conclusions loosely, revising them as the sand reveals or conceals new ground. What has been recovered, though, now numbers in the many thousands of individual artifacts. Rather than disappearing into private collections or scattered museum storage far from the water where they were found, a great many of these objects have come to rest a short distance from the wreck itself, in a museum built specifically to hold them and to explain them to anyone willing to walk through its doors. The Whydah Pirate Museum, established on Cape Cod, not far from the waters where the ship went down, was built around the idea that these objects should not simply be displayed as curiosities behind glass, stripped of context and reduced to treasure for its own sake, but interpreted carefully, so that visitors leave understanding something of the lives that produced them. Cannon and cannonballs recovered from the site sit alongside the ship's bell, the very bell whose inscription first allowed researchers to say with confidence that this particular wreck was, in fact, the Whydah and no other vessel. Coins from a dozen different nations, evidence of the ship's long career, capturing prizes across a wide stretch of ocean, are displayed together, a small monument to how thoroughly international the flow of money and goods across the Atlantic had already become by the early 18th century. Personal items, buckles, buttons, a single leather shoe preserved by the anaerobic conditions of the sea floor are shown not as isolated curiosities, but as fragments of individual lives, remnants of men who dressed themselves each morning aboard that ship, without any sense that these small ordinary objects would one day be all that remained to speak for them. The museum's laboratories continue to work even as its galleries welcome visitors, conservators laboring over concretions that may take months to open, patiently removing centuries of marine growth and rust, to reveal whatever lies inside, whether that turns out to be a single coin or a cluster of tools fused together by time and salt. It is slow work, done mostly out of public view, and it will likely continue for years yet, because the volume of recovered material considerably exceeds what any team could process quickly, however skilled and however dedicated to the task. Among the most quietly significant things that this recovered material has revealed is something that written records alone had only hinted at, which is the sheer diversity of the men who sailed under Bellamy's command. The concretions and skeletal remains brought up from the wreck have, through careful forensic and historical analysis, offered evidence that the crew of the Whydah included men of African descent, some very likely formerly enslaved people who had thrown in their lot with piracy rather than face a life of bondage on land. Alongside European sailors of several nationalities, and Native American crew members as well, all serving together aboard a single vessel under conditions that, whatever their brutality in other respects, appear to have made considerably less distinction by ancestry than the plantations and port cities these men had left behind. This should not be romanticized into something it was not. Piracy did not abolish the era's racial hierarchies, and life aboard the Whydah was not some utopian experiment in equality, conducted for its own sake or as a matter of principle. But it does appear that a ship's company built entirely around survival and profit, at sea, operating outside the reach of colonial law, developed its own practical logic, one in which a skilled or willing hand might be valued regardless of where he had been born or what his skin color was. TAI in ways that the plantations and counting houses of the Americas simply did not allow. The recovered shackles found aboard the wreck, almost certainly remnants of the ship's earlier life as a vessel built to carry captive Africans across the ocean before Bellamy ever took her, sit in stark and deliberate contrast in the museum's galleries with the evidence of the mixed crew that sailed her afterward. And visitors are left to sit with that contrast rather than have it resolved for them into a simple moral. A ship that once carried the enslaved became for a brief period a vessel where some among that same population found a rough kind of freedom. However dangerous, however short-lived, it would ultimately prove to be for nearly everyone aboard. This brings the story, inevitably, to the tension that sits at the heart of any honest telling of the Whydah, and indeed of piracy in this era more broadly, which is the gap between piracy as it lives in popular imagination and piracy, the romantic version, the version of flags and treasure maps and roguish charm, has proven durable for centuries, and there is no use pretending the wreck itself has fully dispelled it, because the gold and silver recovered from that sandbar do undeniably gleam with something of that old promise. But set against the coins and the cannon is the other evidence the sea gave back, the sheer youth of many of the skeletal remains recovered, young men who had perhaps only weeks of piratical life behind them before the storm ended it, the shackles that speak to the trade the ship was built to serve before Bellamy ever set foot aboard her, and the abruptness of the wreck itself, in which more than 100 men drowned within sight of shore in weather that gave them almost no chance at all. Piracy, as this wreck makes plain in its quiet physical way, was rarely a long career. Most men who took it up did not grow old in it, did not retire with their portion of the treasure to some comfortable harbor town, but died young, at sea or on a gallows, having gained perhaps a season or two of comparative freedom and comparative wealth before the arrangement collapsed, as it very often did, into violence. The Whydah does not resolve this tension so much as hold both halves of it up together, the treasure and the shackles, the freedom and the brevity, refusing to let one side erase the other. And so many questions remain open, as historians studying Bellamy and his crew are quick to acknowledge. What exactly drove a man of his apparent charisma and ability toward piracy, rather than some more conventional path, is still debated, as is how democratic his ship's governance truly was in daily practice, beyond what the surviving accounts suggest. Whether more wreckage and treasure still wait beneath that shifting sandbar, and how much of Bellamy's own story was exaggerated by the men who told it after his death, remain unsettled and perhaps unsettlable. Questions left for the water and the historians to keep working over, together for years still to come. The sandbar off Wellfleet does not look like much if a person were to stand on the beach and study it. At low tide, it shows itself as a pale ridge beneath the surf, a place where the water changes color, green to gray, to a churned and unsettled white, where the waves break early over something the sea does not want to let go of easily. Gulls work the shallows there in the mornings. The wind moves across the dunes the way it has moved across them for centuries, carrying sand from one shape into another, burying and unburying whatever lies beneath. Anyone passing by without knowing the history would see nothing but an ordinary stretch of Cape Cod coast, unremarkable, faintly beautiful in the grey Atlantic light. And yet beneath that water, mixed into the sand and the broken timbers and the corroded iron, lies what remains of a ship that once carried the ambitions of hundreds of men across 2 oceans, a ship that was, for a brief season, one of the most feared vessels afloat, and that ended in the space of a single night. As fragments scattered across a few hundred yards of shoal, it is worth returning, at the end of this story, to that image, because it says something the rest of the tale cannot quite say on its own. The Whydah began as an instrument of commerce, built in London to carry captives and goods along the terrible arithmetic of the slave trade, and she became, through capture and reinvention, an instrument of plunder, sailed by men who had themselves often known captivity of one kind or another. By end low decks of merchant ships or the brutal discipline of the Royal Navy. She was, in her short life, many things at once: a slaver, a prize, a pirate stronghold, a treasury, a home of sorts for men who called themselves a company and shared what they took, according to rules that were, however imperfect in practice, more equal than anything most of them had known on land. And then she was a wreck, and then she was a legend, and then, after 260 years of sand and silence, she was an archaeological site, catalogued and studied and displayed in glass cases far from the water that had kept her. It is tempting, when telling a story like this, to reach for a tidy moral, to say that the Whydah's fate proves something simple about greed, or about pirates getting what they deserved, or about the sea punishing those who defied its authority. But the record, examined patiently, resists such simple lessons. Bellamy and his men were not simply villains in the way later fiction would paint pirates. They were, in their own telling, and in the testimony of men like Thomas Davis, participants in something closer to a rough democracy, dividing their plunder by vote, choosing their captain by vote, offering surrendered crews the choice to join or go free. And they were also, undeniably, thieves and sometimes killers, sailing under no lawful flag, answerable to no court but their own, taking by force what other men had built by trade, both legitimate and otherwise. The story does not resolve into a single clean shape. It sits, instead, somewhere in the tangle of ambition and desperation and love and greed that drove men to the account in the first place, and that drove the storm, indifferent to any of it, to take the ship regardless of what she carried or who sailed her. There is a version of this story that centers on Maria Hallett, the young woman said to have loved Bellamy before he sailed, and to have watched from the dunes, according to the old telling, on the night the storm came in. Whether that particular detail is history or invention, shaped by 2 centuries of retelling around Cape Cod hearths, cannot now be settled with certainty. But even as legend, it captures something true about the shape of the story. Young man who left in search of fortune enough to return and marry well, a woman who waited, a fortune that was found and then lost in the space of a single spring. All of it undone in an hour by a storm that cared nothing for reunions or dowries, or the particular hopes carried in the hold of one grey-hulled ship among the many vessels afloat that April night. Ambition and love and greed all sailed together aboard the Whydah, tangled past separating, and the storm judged none of it specifically. It simply came as storms do, and the ship that had survived cannon fire and chase, the ordinary hazards of two oceans, could not survive the water rising beneath her keel on a lee shore in the dark. It is worth pausing too on the larger contest the Whydah's story belongs to, a contest far older than Piracy and far larger than any one ship. It is the contest between what men want and what the wind and water will allow them to have. Sailors and merchants and pirates alike, across every century of the age of sail, pursued fortune across seas that offered no guarantees, that granted swift passage on one voyage and delivered ruin on the next, according to patterns of weather that were understood only dimly and only after the fact by the mariners who tried to read them. Bellamy's crew, choosing to turn north into a coast whose spring storms they may or may not have understood well enough, believed they were making a reasonable choice, weighing the risk of the open water against whatever they judged the sky to be telling them. They were wrong or unlucky or both. And the difference between those two explanations has occupied genealogists of the wreck for years without final resolution. But their wrongness, if it was that, was not unique. It was the same wrongness or the same bad luck that had claimed galleons and merchantmen and naval vessels for centuries before them, and would claim ships for centuries after, wherever human ambition put a wooden hull between itself and a sea that recognized no distinction between a lawful cargo and a stolen one. The Whydah's story, in this sense, is not only a pirate's story. It is a sailor's story, a story about the oldest gamble in maritime history in which a crew commits its fortune, and often its life, to a hull and a set of sails and a hope that the weather will hold long enough to see harbor. The sand has not given up all its answers. Divers and archaeologists working the site since the 1980s have recovered tens of thousands of artifacts, and Barry Clifford and those who came after him have built, from cannon and coin and cutlass and bell, as full a portrait of an actual pirate ship as exists anywhere in the world. But the shifting nature of that sandbar, the way storms rearrange it year by year, means the site is never fully known, never fully closed. Sections believed searched are sometimes found to hold more once a winter storms move enough sand to expose new iron. It is possible, even likely, that portions of the wreck and perhaps portions of what Bellamy's men took from the ships they overtook remain buried still, waiting on some future season's currents to bring them briefly into reach before the sand closes over them again. In this way, the Whydah continues to do what she did in life, which is to hold something back, to keep a portion of herself hidden, even from those who most want to know her fully. The sea keeps its own accounting and shares it only in fragments, on its own schedule, indifferent to the patience or the funding of the archaeologists who wait upon it. And so the story ends, as it began, with water moving over sand, with a shoal off a quiet stretch of Massachusetts coastline that looks, to the casual eye, like nothing at all. Beneath it lies what remains of a ship that carried captives, then carried plunder, then carried a company of men who briefly imagined themselves free of the old hierarchies of the world they had left behind, and then carried nothing at all, broken apart in an April storm and settled slowly into the place where she still rests. The sand continues its work, covering and uncovering, guarding whatever has not yet been found, answering to nothing but the tide. If you have enjoyed this telling, you are welcome to find more stories of great ships across this channel. told at the same unhurried pace for those who wish to drift into other waters and other centuries. Rest well and let the water carry you